For this evening, I'd like to introduce Professor Constantin van Barloewen. Professor is a member of the advisory committee for the Harvard Academy for International Studies at Harvard University. He also the academic coordinator for the Dialogue of Cultures and Civilization of the Foundation of Castle Nuremberg in Berlin, Germany. He's also the founder and director of Symposium and Research Project for the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, on the notation of dignity as the anthropology, a prerequisite of the human right in polarity of world culture. He's also author of more than many books that have been translated to more than 20 languages. He also frequent writers in many journals. The title of this evening's lecture is Human Dignity and Progress in the Polarity of the World Culture. So please turn off your mobile telephones and let's all enjoy the lecture. Thank you very much.
Yes, I might apologize in the beginning for saying I'm not an art historian, which you're normally accustomed, and I'm an anthropologist, and so there might be new angles to new perspectives which we could touch, but I think they are not unimportant, in particular because anthropology is not just a remote topic of academic interest, but it's dealing with very practical questions of our today's world politics and even economy. And this is what I'm trying to do by touching two notions which are crucial for our world civilization, the beginning of the 21st century. The one is the notion of progress, and the next is the notion of human dignity as a prerequisite of the human rights, but always two notions, progress and dignity, in the diversity of cultures, in the plurality of cultures. Since we don't have just one modernity, not only a Western modernity, but we have a plurality of modernities according to different cultures and religious traditions. And sometimes I think the Western countries are underestimating this. Now, if you consider that over the past years, the notion of progress in development policy has been heavily disputed. Just think of the World Bank, think of the Monetary Fund in Washington, but all the ministries of the industrial nations, who, as you know, give economic aid to Africa, to Asia, to Latin America, the European Community, all these international economic corporations, it has become clear that the supposedly reliable concepts of progress more and more have become very questionable. The development policy of the United Nations, just one example, has also distanced itself from a purely quantitative idea of progress, in quotation marks, as a pure economic growth. I might just give you one example. Even in the beginning, you certainly know the kingdom of Bhutan in the Himalaya mountains. I was there many times, and as you know, they have a king of Bhutan, and who fiercely opposes what he calls materialistic growth. In consequence, he defined his own form of happiness. He does not want to link happiness purely to materialistic growth. So in his GNP definition, which he's giving to the World Bank and to United Nations, he considers another form of happiness, not always, let's say, happiness with music, happiness with the family, happiness with literature, with the arts. So he defines happiness in his constitution, not just in materialistic terms. That's just one example. So the question of human development that has been raised since the 1980s, a just example at the United Nations Summit in Rio de Janeiro, which you might remember, Also the report of UNESCO, World Commission for Culture and Development. Just little examples. Also, even at the World Economic Forum in Davos, or at Porto Alegre in Brazil, the summit of the World Social Governments. It has been disputed. Why? Simply because progress is no longer conceived, I might say, as a secular religion, or we might say as a religion of collective salvation. This more Promethean vision of progress, science and technology that has accompanied man in his technological ascent and has been valid since the European-American age of enlightenment. I just might name Francis Bacon, or Descartes, or Montaigne, or of course John Locke in the Anglo-Saxon world. This enlightenment has come under fire. The vision of the 18th century Industrial Revolution, with its Aristotelic notion of progressive, linear history of a human evolution, is being called into question more and more. Just remember, the men of the Renaissance and the Cartesian men were still absolute masters, rulers over creation. This form of progress was marked by yes, you might say, a millenaristic promise of salvation with its own eschatological promise. The omnipresence of science and technology even replaced the figure of God. But this is history. This is the history of the Enlightenment, of the European Enlightenment, of the American Enlightenment, of what you might call Western Enlightenment. Technology even replacing the figure of God. Now, in the last 30 years, in all development theories, this vision has been shaken to its foundations by what you might call, as you know, an ecological awareness for well over 30 years now. More and more it became evident that the scarcity of resources and the ecological threat to our planet, the demand for long-term and sustainable development policy that requires a different way of understanding and dealing with rationality has become a top priority. Just remember the famous Brundtland Commission, which was pointed out already in 1983. So the whole ecological consciousness which we are having today, need to have in our today's world, just think now by the end of December, the summit in Copenhagen of United Nations and for the climate summit. I mean, these are changes which created another notion of progress. In view of this, why is a change of paradigms in international development policy so desperately needed? This concerns not just Germany or France or the European Commission, it concerns the whole Western industrial nations. First of all, because we must assume that there's not only a single modernity, not one modernity, but multiple modernities, various cultural incarnations of modernity according to specific cultural and religious historical prerequisites. Modernity manifests itself in various forms, Western or non-Western. And we have here Islamic traditions, so I think it's evident. But it's evident in Africa, it's evident in Latin America, it's evident in India. We have not just the privilege, rationality is not just the privilege of the West, but has other logics of thinking and acting. Now for thinkers, you might know the name of Jürgen Habermas. He's a famous German philosopher and a thinker. The project of modernity is still universally valid in all debates. Others see multiple modernities as a result of the different cultural and religious historical prerequisites in various cultures. That gives rise to the question of a global ethic, what the theologian Hans Küng, whom you might know, called world ethos. But should there be universal standards, valid for all cultures? This is a crucial question. Or shouldn't be there more relativity against particularity and multiplicity? This problem is particularly important for the notion, this is the second notion I want to introduce tonight, dignity. First was progress, dignity is the second. Dignity as an anthropological prerequisite of the human rights, again, in the diversity of cultures, which we have in our planetary civilization today. This is where a balance must be found. You remember, in the United Nations Declaration of the Human Rights from 1948, shortly after the Second World War, it was written, I'm quoting, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." This is the official phrase of the United Nations in 1948. But of course, this reflects more or less a Western, Judeo-Christian concept of culture, including its tendency to consider itself universal. And this is, of course, questionable. Remember, in 1948, after the Second World War, the United Nations had approximately 50, 53 members, 54, approximately, a bit more than 50. Today, we have nearly 200, 193, 190. I mean, these are differences. This means the world has changed. We have a multipolar world. We have the Islamic traditions, we have Latin America, we have Brazil, we have India, we have China, we have Russia. I mean, the world doesn't look like in 1948. In consequence, what are the implementations for the notion of dignity, which follows? Only if we succeed in understanding the various ethics that influence the thoughts and actions of the founding cultures, religions, and mythologies of the global civilization in a profound anthropological sense, do we stand a chance to reach standards of action in the political discourse of human rights. The demand for universalization and equality must be linked to a commitment to the difference between cultures. That brings us to the problem of reciprocal acknowledgement of differences. You might Martin Buber, the famous theologian, pointed out in his phrase, "The other is always an I." And this is crucial. An interactive relationship must be established between what is different and what is common. The cultural differences of mankind took form in a universal historical process. We shouldn't underestimate human history today, as we can date it back, is approximately 3 to 4 million years. And if we consider that around 35,000 years ago, we had what you might call a symbolic evolution. Religion started the arts. If you think of Altamira, if you think of Lascaux, the graves of Lascaux in France, Altamira, 35,000 before Christ, slowly evolved a symbolic capacity for religion, for the arts, what you might call an cultural evolution started, which became quicker than the just biological evolution. So in this period, the diversity of cultures began to evolve in history of mankind as a treasure, as a richness, as a sign of humanity, which needs to be protected. The plurality of cultures is a treasure of human evolution and shouldn't be destroyed. No one can judge or even condemn other cultures from a bird's eye view. There is, so to speak, no meta-cultural standpoint to judge or to misjudge, not at all. The idea to understand rather than to judge, this is important and should be a first step. It is the concept of human rights only compatible with the Western notion of human rights, along with the ethical and legal foundations. This is a crucial question. Can the contents of a certain culture only be judged by its own standards? I doubt it. Cultural relativism does not justify the conclusion that cultures are in every respect dissimilar monads, to use the philosopher Leibniz metaphor, and have nothing at all in common. Culture-specific characteristics are based on universally valid conditions. Each culture offers different answers to anthropological questions that are basically the same. Thus, there are crystallization points that pervade all cultures. Existential parameters are on our side. Human dignity is such a constant anthropological factor. Now, if we ask ourselves, with this in mind, does the abstract human being referred to in the Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations cover more than the concrete view of man that was formed during the European-American Age of Enlightenment and has been held since Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, John Locke, to name just a few. Jeremy Bentham with his utilitaristic thinking, just a few. That is to say, the participant in the modern Western-style market economy. To what extent do human rights actually serve to ideologically justify the existing cultural, economic, and political supremacy of the West over the peripheral nations? This is a crucial question. You know, there was a couple of years ago in Vienna, you might remember, was a major United Nations conference on human rights. And the West has been fiercely attacked, not just by Islamic traditions, by Latin America, by Africa, by China, for implementing, for having a new form, what they call, of colonial thinking, by implementing Western human rights. So this is, of course, of importance. I mean, if you just consider, take China, one example. China has a completely other cosmology on conception of dignity and human rights. They have what you might call a collective identity of the human being, in concept of the human rights. In the Western tradition of Greek philosophy and Enlightenment, you have the person, the individual, in the center, not in the Confucian ethic at all. It is society. It is much more than the only person. In consequence, civil theology of Confucianism has other cosmologies for human dignity. Now, how are we dealing with this in the West? It's difficult, and it's difficult to answer, because of course, as we know, there are violations of human rights in China. Heavy ones, very heavy ones, as you know. And the West doesn't want to interfere. But it is a question how we can balance and find a balance, on the one hand, between the universal necessity for the human rights, and on the other hand, the respect for the diversity of cultures. It's not, I'm not having the answer, I'm very honest. But I want to raise the question. It's a contradiction which we are facing. On the one hand, we have the Declaration of the United Nations of 48, giving dignity. The notion of dignity is even in the concept of United Nations, in the Constitution, as you might remember. On the other hand, we have the wish, in the sense of UNESCO, in the sense of the World Bank, to respect the diversity of cultures, be it in Islamic tradition, be it in Africa, be it in China, wherever. And there are contradictions, because some of the other nations don't have the same cosmologies for dignity than the Western Enlightenment. If you just reconsider that nature of man is a word which not easily can be used. We might better use natural culturality that leaves a great wealth of cultural historical possibilities open. In the millions of years of human evolution, there is no, so to speak, Archimedean point that would allow us to overlook the entire historical world. Hence, there is no, what you might say, universal ratio, rationality. Rationality is not the privilege of the West only. There are other cultures which all also have their own form of rationality. Take India. I mean, take India, which is a culture of the Hindu's culture 30,000 years before Christ. Take Japanese traditions, the Tokugawa period, take 16th, 17th century, take the Meiji Restoration of 1868. I mean, Japan has deepest historical traditions, but they are not Western necessarily. And these are the other contradictions which we are facing. Ultimately, human nature is what you might call historically open-ended. The Western logos, in the sense of the Greek notion of Greek mythology, the logos, rationality, is not universally valid. Ultimately, it cannot even survive without mythology. We have a problem today in Western countries, industrial countries, what I would call, you might call it a logocentrism, an over-rationalization of the world, an over abstraction of the world, an algebraization, you might even call it. And of course, you have the loss of the sacred, since secularization, but you also have a loss of mythology. I mean, in historical, archaic traditions, it was mythology who guided mankind, in archaic traditions, in archaic cultures, always. And just with an industrial revolution, with the upcoming of modernity, it was the logos, logocentrism, rationality, Descartes, cogito ergo sum, entered public life. And this has consequences. Mythology disappeared, but the logos, we more and more find out, rationality in industrial nations is not sufficient. We cannot survive. Man cannot survive without, you might call, mythology, a dimension of mythology. Now, other cultures in Asia, cultures in Africa. In Africa, you have still, in traditional countries and cultures of Africa, I personally know Madagascar very well, I've written many books about it, you have an ancestor cult, still today. You have a great mythology. You have an oral tradition in literature. We shouldn't underestimate this, because they simply can't write. They are not less valuable. They have oral traditions of literature which are very prestigious. They are beautiful to listen to. They have other conceptions of death. We spoke about it. How do people die in the West? They die normally beyond Spanish walls, in a hospital, neglected by the family, without the circle of a family, not in Madagascar. In Madagascar, people are dying inside the family, respected. So mythology, archaic mythology, is still valid, is livable, so to speak. And the same in Latin America, of course. Latin America lives with its own mythology, which is expressed in literature, in the arts, in painting, in music, in film, of course. Think of the great tradition of music in Brazil, even popular music, which we Caetano Veloso or Gilberto Gil. There are plenty of examples. The intellectual historical roots of human rights can be traced back to various examples. One example, the divine stature of man that shines through the Bible, or to the cosmopolitan Stoic philosophy in Greek philosophy. The word dignitas, the Latin word dignitas, was first mentioned in the Roman thinker Cicero, the famous thinker Cicero, in his writing in Latin called De Officiis, from the year 44 before Christ. This is the first time how the notion of dignity was entering the public discussion in the Western world. It was in the Roman philosophy of Cicero in his writing De Officiis. Concepts of human rights, but this is again the contradiction, also appear in other non-Western traditions, especially in man's calling as God's vicegerent on earth in the Quran, for example, or in the right of resistance as it entrenched in black African mythologies. These reflections show that human rights are certainly not a sole privilege of the Occident. This is the arrogance of the Western countries believing this. It's not true. History of politics is always a history of law. The Stoic philosophy in the Greek heritage, in the Greek philosophical heritage, the Stoic philosophy of thought, or even before, the enlightening narratives of the Javis and the Troika Dei, the first legal principles that were laid down in the 16th century by the Jesuits in Paraguay. You might remember that the Jesuits had a whole state in Paraguay for many decades. The Jesuits have been very important in the history of Paraguay, Latin America, having not just church, but schools and music and the arts. They formed the whole nation. I just want to mention the famous theologian Bartolomé de las Casas in the Enlightenment of Latin America, who came from Spain and was a defender of the native Indians. Bartolomé de las Casas was the first Spanish philosopher in the 16th century, we should not forget this, who defended the indigenous rights of the Indians in Latin America. And this also was a sign of dignity, of course, of human rights. It was in the late Spanish scholasticism, Catholic scholasticism in Latin America. Then, of course, the critique of domination on the part of the British liberalism in Europe, and the self-understanding of the subject in the famous German idealism, the school of idealism in Germany, in history of thought, in literature, in poetry in the 19th century. I'm just giving a couple of examples wherever we find notions of human dignity. All these bear witness to the experiences and efforts that were involved in the writing of the first article of the Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. From a universal historical point of view, human rights obviously do not belong exclusively, this is what I'm trying to say, to the Western legal culture. Christian charity, take the notion of Christian charity, very important in the Bible, charity. Christian charity has parallels in Islamic solidarity or in Buddhist empathy with all its beings. The notion of compassion, a very important notion, compassion. In German, you wouldn't we say Mitgefühl, but the notion of compassion in Christian theology is important. Also in the American Constitution. Compassion links religions and cultures together. Even civil theologies of Confucianism. In China, I'm trying to make bridges of notions of dignity in different cultures. In the Hindu councils of wisdom, it's important for the Hindu tradition in India, the specific notion of wisdom, very important for Indian culture. Just think of the famous epics of Indian culture, the Mahabharata, the famous Mahabharata, of substance for human dignity, or of course of Buddhism in Thailand. Again, in Buddhism, you find the idea of compassion. So I'm just trying to give a couple of key notions which are existing in different cultures, where we could make bridges in the sense of an intercultural dialogue. The affirmation of the multitude of cultures, especially non-European cultures, even when it comes to human dignity, means turning back to the reservoir of companionship on the basis of a whole humanitarian idea. The basic idea of inviolability of human dignity is a common ground, albeit space and time dependent. Therefore, it has brought forth different religious and cultural ways of life. Hence, the human rights movement has been pluralist from the start. The 1948 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was made under the dominance of the Western industrial countries. We shouldn't forget that, except China. China was an exception, except China. It was the war countries, France, England, America, Russia, Western countries. No Islamic country, no Latin American country, no African country. When this we have to consider. And now we have 200 nations at Unite. Of course, they have different notions of dignity. Therefore, the question is it universal valid? Is it now being put into as a test? Equal rights for different cultural ways of life must be the aim. The compatibility of universal standards with cultural, religious, and ethnic diversity is at the center of stage. That implies a human right to be different. To be different is a human right, just to be different. Be it in Kuwait, be it in Rio de Janeiro, be it in Ecuador, wherever. The right to be different is a necessity of the human question of dignity. Therefore, I personally would like, let's say, to introduce to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which was put out, as I told you, in 1948, the phrase, I'm quoting, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. In their cultures, they seek to express their dignity in different ways and to respect freedom and justice. Therefore, not only nature, but cultures also deserve respect. This, as an anthropologist, I would like, let's say, to modify the declaration which has been put out just by Western countries in 1948 after the war. Human rights are the ethical foundation of a key term that describes a global culture that needs no justification, but faces the conflicts between historical singularity of cultural phenomena and the Western claim to universal validity that is expressed in the Human Rights Declarations already of the 18th century. If you read Rousseau, study carefully Rousseau, a major thinker. However, this is a Western tradition. And dignity and human rights are again only considered out of this Western tradition. Rousseau, take Montaigne, but there are plenty of examples of the Enlightenment thinkers. I think the idea of a monolithic, synchronized global civilization today, the beginning of the 21st century, is not only a reduction of the universal historical process which we are facing in 3 million years, but much more, it's the necessity to respect cultural diversity. Also, or we might put it better, to avoid any cosmic imbalance and a denial of human creation that is expressed in the individual founding cosmologies of world religions and the concept of dignity. You see, we are facing today's world giving technocracy, kratos in the Greek heritage, power, kratos, power. We have technocracy today. We have, on the one hand, we have a tremendous technological uniformity and homogenization spreading worldwide, giving technology progress worldwide. It goes to the last country in the world on the one hand. On the other hand, we have a certain Balkanization in ethnic, religious terms. Think of Kosovo. Think of the former Soviet Union. All the countries, it happens. Think of Congo. Think of China, parts of India. There you see ethnic, religious conflicts when you have Sikhs, you have Hindus, you have Muslims in just one country. So a monolithic global culture, which maybe the West would like to have, would be politically unlivable and unsafe, and would be even an artificial creation. Ultimately, it would be an act, I would call it, of Western arrogance or even Occidental cultural provincialism, which can appear under different signs. The quest for mutual understanding between cultures as a prerequisite for coexistence in the global civilization of the beginning of the 21st century must overcome all forms, let's call it, of cultural positivism. Human rights are certainly universal, no doubt, but they are interpreted in different ways. Plurality remains the specific characteristic of the conditio humana. Basically, I think a new form, let's call it cosmopolitanism. Let's call it, why not? Let's call it cosmopolitanism in the Greek heritage of Greek philosophy. I think a new form of cosmopolitanism is called for. We shouldn't forget the term cosmopolitan goes back, at least in the Greek philosophy, to the Cynics in the 4th century before Christ, who coined the expression, I'm quoting, citizens of the cosmos. This was the Greek heritage. I think we should remember this great Greek heritage. Each citizen, the Greek called it polites, belonged to a city, to a polis, which was the Greek notion of the polis, to which he owed loyalty, and that could help us in the human rights debate. The cosmos was the world, not only the earth, but the universe. That's the difference, because man also just doesn't have the earth empirically, he has the cosmos. Man is a metaphysical animal. We are facing death. Man is the only animal in history of evolution which is facing death. In consequence, he's a metaphysical animal facing death. So he does not just have an empirical dimension, he has a cosmic dimension. The traditional cosmopolitan knew that human beings are different, and he aspired to learn from these differences. He tried to combine both ideals, universal concern for the other and the respect for legitimate differences. In this tradition, I would call the necessity today in our world civilization what you might call a civic humanism. Let's call it a civic humanism is needed. Unity in multiplicity, multiplicity in unity. We need a balance, and this is important. Now, coming back to the notion of progress, how do these reflections bear on the notion of progress? What role does the anthropological, cultural dimension play in development politics today for the industrial nations? Understood in a holistic anthropological sense, and this I think is important to say, culture becomes the decisive factor of realpolitik. I think this is truly important. As an anthropologist, which I am, culture for me is not just the festival of Bayreuth or of Salzburg or whatever. This is another form of culture, important. For me, culture is holistic. Economy is a part of culture, not vice versa. Culture part of economy. So culture is an existential form of life for human beings worldwide. As I called it, a factor of realpolitik, a serious factor of realpolitik, especially in economic matters such as work ethic, organization capability, attitudes toward time, present, past, future orientedness, with all the effects on the various levels of innovation capacity and investment decisions in the individual cultures of Europe, North, Latin America, Asia, Africa, Russia, Japan, the Islamic world. I might just say one word. We did 3 years ago, we did a major project with the German Ministry for Economic Development in Germany and United Nations and the Goethe Institute worldwide, questioning the notion of progress in different cultures. And we did major conferences with not just leading scholars and Nobel Prize winners, also politicians, ministers, heads of state in Calcutta, in India, for the Asian traditions, in the Library of Alexandria, for the Islamic traditions, in Bolivia, in Latin America, where you have nearly 70% of the population is indigenous Indian. I mean, we shouldn't forget this. Aymara, Guarani, whatever. They have another time conception. They don't have, in the Western tradition, a linear Aristotelic time conception going forward to the future, the Calvinistic tradition, North America. Not at all. They are backwards. Their time vector is the prophetic past of the great Inca and Aztec heritage. In consequence, their whole time conception is oriented to the past, not to the future. Now, of course, if Germany, whatever, implements technological aid, industrial aid, hundreds of millions, how should these Indians accept this? They are culturally different. They have different time conceptions. Their death conception is different. Their whole work ethic is different. This is what I always try to say to the German Minister of Economic Development. It's just a difference whether you invest out of the World Bank $100 million to Ecuador or to Indonesia, which is mostly in Islamic traditions, or to Japan or to China, because cultures are different. The values are different. The logics of thinking and acting are different cultures. And I think it's of danger that the industrial nations, even the World Bank, just quantify human mankind, not qualified according to different cultural traditions, which they should, because technology is not neutral. If technology is not acculturated to the specific cultural traditions or religions, it destroys identity. It destroys culture and finally human identity. And this is what happened in Peru, for example, 20 years ago, with the consequence that people have been alienated, went to the street in poverty, and became terrorists. The Shining Path, you remember, was 10, 15 years ago, was a major, still today it's a problem for Peru. These are alienated peasants who have been implemented by partly technology, which they didn't understand, and destroyed identity, went to the street and became violent. So this has practical political implications. Westernization, we might put it that way, modernization and westernization are not always one and the same thing. This is important, very also for Islamic traditions. In development policy, we must take the plurality of cultures into account as a characteristic of human evolution. It is obvious that cultural diversity and biodiversity, this is also an important point, and now for the climate question, and for the whole ecological question, for sustainable development, cultural diversity and biodiversity are interrelated. In a variety is a vital factor of global development and lasting prosperity. One of the most important responsibilities of the global civilization is to realize these action options for the future by accepting the cultural heritage of mankind. The development of cultural creativity can only be understood against the backdrop of natural and cultural diversity. It is important to bear in mind that human beings are not only citizens of nations, but primarily members of cultures and religions. First of all, today, as I said, almost 200 nations are represented in the United Nations, but we have thousands of religions and thousands of cultures which are not necessarily congruent with the borderlines of nation states. And of course, this creates conflict, evidently, in Africa and all over, in Asia. The internationalization of economy, its centrifugal force that is increasing all around the world, conjures up archaic traditions in the spiritual, religious sphere. All form, in quotation, I know it's a difficult word, however, in quotation mark, fundamentalism of every description takes on the form of anti-modernism. This is important. It happened in Iran. Remember the Shah, when he tried to implement Western technology with all force, with lots of money, he failed. Archaic traditions showed up and swept him away. And all the military force didn't help much. So we have on the one hand westernization, modernization, technology, and on the other hand, you might call it a spiritual upheaval. You might call it an archaic upheaval, which it's like an anthropological thermostat. The totalization of the earth is gaining momentum through the world economy and technocracy, kratos in the Greek philosophy, power. Along with the planetarization of the world economy, however, the political, the religious structures of the planet are breaking apart. The ever-fasting growing cosmopolitan trade and exchange of information, take the digital revolution, the electronic age which we're having, the whole digital revolution, internet, through the media, go hand in hand with extreme, what we call territorial nervousness. The global village in which we are living is experiencing nationalisms, be they secular or religious, the kind of segregation and tribalization that manifests itself as civil war and conflicts. Think of ex-Yugoslavia, for example, tragic. Kosovo. These are wars over religious identities. Political integration does not follow on the heels of economic integration automatically. This is a wrong belief, too optimistic. Say in the APEC nation, the ASEAN nations, well, right now President Obama is in Asia, in the GATT negotiations, in the Andean Pact in Latin America, and the Mercosur also. I mean, it's Uruguay, it's Argentina, it's Brazil. Secular economic totalization is confronted with an unleashed cultural, religious, let's call it Balkanization, as an antipode to the threatening standardization and homogenization of the globe. That goes, it happened in Algeria 10 years ago, 10, 12, 13 years ago, you remember better than I do probably. It happened in Sri Lanka, still happens in Sri Lanka. It happens, as I said, in the whole former Soviet Union, or in Africa, in Latin America, in Congo, or today in Colombia, tragic in Colombia. There seems to be an anthropological thermostat, so to speak, that has correcting effects on the cultural integrity of mankind at the beginning of the 21st century. Now, what follows finally all of this for development policy, for the industrial nations? We have to ask ourselves, what is really modern? What is modern? What is modern? It's a simple but it's a serious question. In what sense can there be an Islamic and Confucian or a Hindu or Latin American modernity? That's a crucial question. How would other modernities differ from Occidental modernity? Is Islam, in all its complexity, truly faced with the alternatives of Mecca or mechanization? How does the relationship of tradition and modernity, that's crucial for all countries, manifest itself? The aim must be a balance between the affirmation of cultural characteristics and the universal principle of modernity, without one excluding the other. Military and technocratic disarmament alone will not be sufficient. Let's call it cultural disarmament is also required. This is a crucial point. Culture is more than folklore. This is serious. Culture is more than folklore. It is a factor of realpolitik. I just can say it again. A decisive factor of realpolitik, not just folklore. This is underestimating the importance of culture in an anthropological sense. There's nothing neutral about technology. It needs to be acculturated to the individual cultural and religious traditions if it's not to destroy human identity. The notion of, let's call it, multiple modernity serves as a compensation mechanism and escape route in peace politics. And this we are all aiming for, peace politics. There can be no peace between nations as long there's no peace between cultures and religions. And this is a crucial sentence which we all should keep in mind. Can't be any peace between nations without peace between cultures and religions. In conclusion, what implications does this have for the notion of progress and dignity? We have to remember, over the past 500 years, approximately 500 years, think back of Matteo Ricci, the Jesuit in China, think back about Portuguese and Spanish expansion to Latin America, of course, British expansion to North America, Vasco da Gama, plenty of examples. Over the last 500 years, we have experienced let's call it the universalization of the Western model of civilization and the flattening of historically grown cultural and religious traditions. Affirming the multitude of logics of thought and action in the world and giving non-Western forms of rationality a chance to express themselves might be a way out. Today, we are seeing an unprecedented, simultaneous manifestation of cultures and nations in the world. Also because of the electronic age, we have access, as you know, via television, via internet, to the most remote villages of the world, be it in Africa, be it in Paraguay, wherever this was 50 years ago, not the case. Progress must be understood in accordance with the multitude of cultures with its various cosmologies and value systems. Culture is a vector of development policy and a factor of regulatory policy. The aim of development policy for the industrial nations should be truly understood as a conceivable factors that influence nations and economies. The dimension of culture history is underestimated in realpolitik, and yet it is essential in order to approach the logics of thought and action, the inner motive force of society and its economy. And I just would like to mention Germany, for example, as you know, we have a Ministry for Economic Development, and we had for the last 12 years a female minister who was very active, and many times I talked to her. Just imagine the amount of money which the Western nations have given to Africa as aid, as development aid, the last 50 years is 6 times as high as the Marshall Plan of America after the Second World War to Germany. Just to give you a number, what are the results? There's still AIDS in Africa, there's still poverty. So I think, and I was told them, as long as you don't take these cultural factors, the identity, the specific heritage into account, all these investments do not make much sense, because other cultures are different and they need to be respected in their own value. So when planning elements, you see, let's say by digging a water or by making cutting trees or whatever you do, building hospitals, making dams, whatever, planning elements for the industrial nations and the economic aid should include the understanding of the other culture to better understand the necessities, to better understand how to do it, what makes them tick, so to speak. Otherwise, you might have technically correct planned development aid, which simply doesn't reach the other country, because the other country is different. And the Western nations do not estimate this enough. And I remember long talks to the former World Bank President James Wolfensohn recently in New York, who's a very enlightened, I must say, very enlightened person. And it was James Wolfensohn who tried, and sometimes failed, to include in the World Bank these anthropological categories. And the economists and bankers didn't understand him easily. They thought, what is he doing? We invest $100 million to Ecuador, this should be sufficient. It isn't sufficient, as long as you don't take other values into account. And President Wolfensohn always tried to, Mr. Zöllig, now the World Bank begins to understand the necessity, and also the European Commission. The European Commission has a commissioner for development politics. They also take these qualitative categories of other cultures, wherever, be it Africa, be it Latin America, into account. Otherwise, technically correct projects might fail. Economy is only a part or even a result of culture and religious historic traditions. There can be no thing as an independent, universal rationality. It doesn't exist. Rationality is not a universal. It is bound to cultural traditions, and not just Western traditions, We have to ask ourselves, why did certain countries develop politically stable and economically dynamic, like Japan, after the major restoration we spoke about, after 1868, with few natural resources, lots of population. Others, like Latin America, 500 million people, European constitutions, abundance of natural resources, failed, have poverty today, and need money from the First World. Why? Again, I think without taking into account, let's say, the strong scholastic Catholicism in Latin America, the high spirituality, the completely different work ethic, which comes from the long mercantilistic Spanish heritage, where medieval Spain was transported to Latin America, in contrast to North America, where you had the Calvinistic work ethic from the beginning of the 17th century, where you had pragmatism as a philosophy. Pragmatism means, like William James is saying, having a cutting edge, having practical results. That's important. You have had the social Darwinism, Herbert Spencer in the 19th century. All these are items of a history of ideas, even history of philosophy, which make us understand why a culture develops. We spoke about it. North American universities, from the beginning, 1620, 1630, was Harvard University, not just had philosophy, but they had practical matters, chemistry, physics, natural sciences. Latin American universities are 100 years older, are 1480, 1490, 1520. San Marcos in Peru, for example, Santo Domingo, 100 years older than North America, but only had theology and philosophy, no practical natural sciences. I mean, these are indicators, I just can mention a few, why cultures develop differently. The strong Catholic scholasticism, the intuitive philosophy, intuition in Latin America, has another acceptance of technology, of modernity. Modernity always was alien to Latin America. Still today, Latin America, Octavio Paz, the great Nobel Prize winner for Mexico, he wrote about it. He said, Latin America still today has a broken relation to modernity. They don't accept modernity. They are living in a historical past, the great historical past of the pre-Columbian cultures, Olmecs, Aztecs, Incas, whatsoever, broken to modernity. Not North America. North America had the manifest destiny in the 19th century. North America was oriented to the future, always to the future. Of course, the pragmatism, the logic, the whole analytical capacity of North America made it much easier to accept technology, to create industrial potential than Latin America. Of course, Latin America also had just a mercantilistic system. This comes in addition. I just mentioned this with a few words to try, by the dialectic of the American double continent, North and Latin America, if you compare it to Japan, for example, to make us understand why it is important to understand first cultures and then afterwards economies and the potential of economies. If you ask ourselves, why do certain states develop dynamically and others not? With simple economic factors, you wouldn't understand. They are not sufficient enough. You need the history of cultures and religions, certainly. Today, we can no longer believe in an absolute global culture in the beginning of the century. But we are forced to acknowledge the openness of a pluralism of cultures. The same is essential for the notion of progress and dignity. Culture and technology have to be compatible. An economic and technological development that goes against prevailing cultural values is bound to fail. Little example. Please remember, when the Soviet Union collapsed 20 years ago, there was Jeffrey Sachs from Harvard and others who tried to implement American ideas, American, quotation mark, capitalism to Russia. And they failed completely because the Russian prerequisites, the cultural, have been different. In Poland, they collapsed also. They tried it in Bolivia, Jeffrey Sachs in particular, and failed. It's not so easy to implement a certain economic system to another culture which is not prepared for it, giving thousands of years of history. So an economic and technological development that goes against the cultural heritage cannot succeed. That is, just take the notion of karma in the Indian tradition. If you have a notion of karma, this means you are living in this world, you're working, and as you would succeed in life, you are benefit after death. If you have such an idea of karma, your work ethic is completely different, even your conception of death, than in a Calvinistic tradition, or in a Latin American tradition, or in the consensus principle of Japanese culture. So, Catholic scholasticism and the prophetic past has other prerequisites than the Calvinistic heritage of the matter-of-fact Protestantism of the early pilgrims in North America. Just these little examples to show the plurality of culture and the consequences for politics and economy, and also the consequences for whole economic development. And certainly this touches, we spoke also Islamic traditions. When we speak about the question, why does Islam develop or does not develop dynamically? Why is there stagnation? Where does the stagnation come from? I mean, I think we have to look also in Islamic traditions for historical roots. The question, has there been an enlightenment? What kind of enlightenment has there been in the European tradition, or in the Islamic tradition, or in the Latin American tradition? What consequences? With regard to the notion of progress and dignity, we must distinguish between purely quantitative economic growth on the one hand and development in the sense of, let's call it human progress, simply human progress, on the other hand. You see, there's President Sarkozy in France right now is doing a major commission with 2 Nobel Prize winners, Amartya Sen from Harvard, an economist and philosopher, and Joseph Stiglitz from Columbia University. And they are trying, and the World Bank also is trying this. They are trying to understand what are the factors to measure progress. And they more and more find in statistics we spoke about. Also in Germany, there are people giving the alternative of earning 1,000 euros more per month, or having more time with their families, or with arts, leisure, cinema, music, whatever, poetry. They choose poetry. They choose family instead of 1,000 euros more. This indicates that you cannot just measure progress in the sense of materialistic statistics like has been done. And the commission of President Sarkozy at present, with the 2 Nobel Prizes, just recently published a huge document, I read it carefully, indicating how different, and also the World Bank needs to understand the quality of life. I mean, the question, what is happiness? Crucial. Well, for all of us, what is happiness? What is a good life? A good life in the Greek. The question of a good life was the major question of Greek philosophy. Plato, Socrates, I mean, wherever you read, the question of good life, this is the question of Greek philosophy. And if you ask this question, and in statistics today, you more and more you find that it's not strictly economic at all. Of course, we must distinguish in countries like India, where you have 600 million poverty, that's evident, or in Brazil, people are dying in Calcutta, dying on the street of hunger, evident. There you need food, simple food, that's clear. But I'm speaking about a segment of population. In India, it's 200-300 million already, of a growing middle class who buys refrigerators, who buys cars, whatever, who, of course, in the industrial nations, who have a certain affluence already. And these segments of population rather choose happiness, quality, life, the arts, family, instead of more money. So this is an indicator. And this is what I would call human progress. On the other hand, economic growth alone is not the same as development. We should pay attention. Simple economic growth is not the same as development. Modern science and technology lead, what you might call, to a mechanistic understanding of the universe that is not necessarily shared by non-Western cultures. Africa with mythology, Latin America with completely spiritual traditions. They don't share this, let's call it mechanistic Western cosmology at all. They refuse it aggressively, violently partly. And in Islamic traditions, you also have this anti-modernism partly in a very violent form. Unification without unity. This was the great Nobel Prize winner, Octavio Paz, from Mexico, once called the global civilization. But the global civilization ought not to be centralistic or monotheistic, certainly not monotheistic, but diverse. Not continental, but what I would call archipelagic. And there Latin America, if you might allow me, has a great tradition because of a creolization. Let's call it creolization. In Latin America, you have a mixture of cultures, always from the beginning of colonization. And the world civilization has become a multipolar civilization today. I mean, it doesn't happen by pure chance. President Obama now travels to China. Didn't go last week to Germany for the 20-year celebration of the fall of the wall. He didn't come. He was invited 20 times. He refused to come because he thought this is the past. Let Mr. Gorbachev go, Mr. Kohl go, all right. I go to Asia. That's the future, the multipolar world. And he entered yesterday China with the words, I want China to be an equal partner in a multipolar world. This would have been impossible just 10 years ago. So this is what I would call an archipelagic civilization of multipolarity. The world today, to use two Greeks' work to make peace, a culture of peace, the world today doesn't need an agora. It It doesn't need an arena, it needs an agora. This was my dear friend, the great philosopher from India, Raimundo Panikkar, who is 91 years of age and nearly dying right now in Spain, great philosopher of religion, a Hindu and a Catholic priest. He's a Hindu and a Catholic priest, a friend of all the popes. He always said to me, the world doesn't need an arena, the world needs an agora. This means in keeping the notions of dignity and progress. Otherwise, we have a loss of identity which is imminent to the world civilization. The notion of human happiness also varies in different cultures, as does the wealth of traditional and indigenous knowledge that could be of greater value in development policy than just imported, let's call it exogenous technology. We have endogenous technology and exogenous. Take a country like Venezuela. Why are they suffering? They are fairly rich by oil. However, since 40 years, long before Mr. Chavez is just making the same mistakes, they just imported from the West exogenous technology. Now, Japan, and why is Japan so successful after the Meiji Restoration of 18? Because they started by importing technology, German technology. For example, they even got, they duplicated Bismarck's legal system, partly Japan. However, in the beginning it was exogenous, but they created an own technological environment in the universities, in the companies. So more and more after 3 generations, they changed from imported exogenous to endogenous technology, which is in congruence with the own cultural traditions. This is one of the major reasons why Japan has succeeded economically, because they have been capable to create endogenous. Latin never, Venezuela never. They just import, and this is refused by the population, by the rulers. It doesn't work. You cannot just import technology. You will fail. Japan is one reason for their success, because they created, with Sony Corporation, with all the leading Toyota, whatever they did, they created an endogenous technology. And India has today a major problem, because India, the miracle of India, which is existing, no doubt, but it's mostly in Bangalore, it's in the digital revolution, and it's mostly imported exogenous technology, and India is, they know it, tremendously try to create universities for endogenous technology, for mathematics, for physics, for chemistry, to create an own capacity to produce technology, not just import Western technology. In Bangalore, what are they doing? They are doing the software from America because of the time difference of 10 hours, whatever. America shifts it over, they send it back because they are cheaper in producing in America. But this might end someday. When the wage is going up in India also, this ends quickly in 10, 15 years. So if China has the same problem, but China is better succeeding. So the Chinese economy is about to create endogenous technology. This is one reason for success, for long-standing success. And Latin America until Brazil a little bit, partly, but not really. The question, why do certain countries produce patents, technological patents? North America, a lot. Look to the statistics. In 100 years, North America and Europe on the top. Latin America non-existing. Venezuela a little bit, Brazil with the oil money a little bit, but not much. Doesn't exist. Nations which don't have patents, which don't create endogenous patents, cannot succeed economically on the long range at all. Look at Germany, the miracle of the Industrial Revolution. The miracle of the Industrial Revolution in Europe was of course endogenous technology. Finally, good life in various cultures. Material growth, and I come to the end, material growth alone does not mean human progress. And growth of civilization, and this is what we all should aim at, growth of civilization, not just material growth, be it Western or not Western. And being a Westerner myself, I would say, we Westerners should try to find a balance and avoid all sort of haughtiness or even arrogance. More than ever, let's call it a meta-political wisdom. Let's call it a meta-political wisdom is needed, which might come from India, which might come from Islamic traditions, which might come from Latin America. I personally, to end with this, I don't believe, very honestly, I don't believe in any superiority of the Western industrial man, never believed. Look at the 20th century, the genocide of Germany, Nazi Germany, look at or China, look at, I mean, there's no need for any arrogance of Western countries. We should convert a teaching civilization into a learning civilization. Self-knowledge is the first step to understanding the world in a, let's call it a polylogue of civilizations in the 21st century. Thank you.